Welcome to Living Word Ministries with our director and Bible teacher, Debbie Blank. Debbie's passion is for you to understand and apply God's truths to your life. Now let's listen and enjoy teaching from the Word of God with Debbie Blank.
Let's go back to the topography. You got the Kidron Valley on the right. I don't know if you can see it as well in this. You got the Taropanian Valley on the left of Mount Moriah, and then you have the Valley of Hinnom on the bottom. It forms a W. That W, well, let me get it for you. That W, that's what it looks like in the Hebrew language. It's the 21st letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's called a Shin, S-H-I-N, which stands for El Shaddai, the Almighty One, the All-Sufficient One, which we get from, oh, it doesn't show it there, but it's from Genesis 17:1. That says, "Now when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless," is what God told Abraham. That's the first time we see El Shaddai. El Shaddai, the Sheen is the sh sound. So Shaddai, El means God. Yes? What are you going to say? Oh, and that's the Sheen. The El means God, and then you have Shaddai, which means Almighty One. The Shah part of that is the Sheen. That's the sound that a Sheen makes, is a Shah. If it has a little dot over it, it also could make a different sound, a Sa sound or a Shah sound. But in here it's a Shah sound. But it's a Sheen. Now, does this look familiar? What does it look like? It looks like the valleys of Jerusalem, the topography. Let's go back. You've got the W. You got the valley there, the valley here, and the valley here. God imprinted his Sheen on the city of Jerusalem, which is his all-sufficiency, him being God Almighty, is imprinted on the topography of that land. When God said he put his name there, he physically put his name there because of the topography. I want to go back just to that other map that I had to show you because I think it's so clear. Here you go. You can't see the Taropanian in the middle, but you get the idea of the W here, of the Sheen, of God stamping his name. What other city in the world can you look at from above and see God's alphabet right there in his land? And he was saying that when the priests gave their blessing, they did this symbol. What does that look like? Dr. Spock. Live long and prosper. But it's really the sign of the Sheen. Is the what? The Vulcans were Jewish, very possibly. So when the priest blessed people with the blessing from Numbers chapter 6, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. This is how the priests did it when they gave that blessing. And it represents the Sheen. Pardon me? That was Numbers chapter 6. No. Oh, the Sheen, that's Genesis 17:1. And let me get you the Numbers passage just for that blessing. It is Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 to 26. Now, isn't that neat? God has stamped his name, is what I say. He stamped his name on his city. He has put his name on his city, according to the passage in 1 Kings that we just saw. Now, this gives you an idea of where Jerusalem is. We've been talking about it, but we don't really know where it is on the map. According to the modern Israel, and this is the same place as it's always been, but this is a modern Israeli map. The Dead Sea is the sea that you see to your right of Jerusalem, and the Sea of Galilee is up in the north. Jerusalem is just about right in the middle of the city. You can see a little bit from this map that it's in the mountainous range, which is why you see all the hills that the city is made of. So that just gives you an idea of where the ancient and the modern city of Jerusalem is. Now let's talk about the temple, because this is very significant. We've talked about many of the names of the city of Jerusalem, but do you know where the temple was, the first temple was? In what city was it? Jerusalem. Okay, that was an easy question. Where was it in Jerusalem? I've already shown you the map. Where was it in Jerusalem? It was up on the north part of what was the city of David in the Old Testament times. And it's kind of in the center part of, well, it's to the west of the Mount of Olives right now. Let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 24. Who built the first temple? Solomon did. And who was Solomon? David's son. So when the kings started in Israel, the first king was Saul. He was not related to David. He disobeyed God, so God anointed David as the next king, and he made a promise to David. What was that Davidic promise or the Davidic covenant? What did he promise David? That the Messiah would be born through him. That his son, Solomon, would sit on the throne, but then that the Messiah would come through his lineage. That was a promise. That's what we call the Davidic covenant. So keep that in mind. Now, one thing David always wanted to do was build a temple for God. But God wouldn't let him. Why? He was a warrior. He was a warrior king. And God wouldn't let him do it, even though he wanted to. But he did let his son Solomon do it. Let's find out where it's going to be built. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this until we get to the end. But in 2 Samuel chapter 24, David did a really bad thing. I know you find that hard to believe with David. But he did. And this time what he wanted to do was number the people in his army. Not a big deal. I mean, Moses did it. David had done it before. But this time he did it when God didn't want him to. So even when he told Joab, his commander, to go number the people, Joab said, "Oh, are you sure? I mean, you really don't want to do this, do you?" And yeah, I want to do this. So they went out and numbered the people. Took 9 months and 20 days, and it says in verse 9 that there were 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and men of Judah were 500,000. So they had a lot of people. I mean, they had 1.3 million people that were valiant warriors throughout Israel. He found that out. What good did it do him? Not much. Because it says in verse 10, David's heart troubled him after he had numbered the people. So David said to the Lord, "I have sinned greatly in what I've done. But now, O Lord, please take the iniquity of thy servant away, for I have acted very foolishly." And God said, in effect, yeah, you have. And you know what? As in every sin, there's going to be a consequence. But David, I'm going to let you choose the consequence. He gave him 3 choices. In verse 13, Gad, who was the prophet, came to David and told him and said, "Shall 7 years of famine come to you in the land?" That was one option. The second one, or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? He'd already done that with Absalom, and it wasn't a lot of fun, so I'm sure he didn't want to do that again. Or shall there be 3 days of pestilence in the land? Well, to me, that's a no-brainer. I'd take the 3 days of pestilence, because then it's over. But I don't know if he counted the cost for that. Verse 14 says, David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let us now fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, but do not let me fall into the hand of men. So he chose the third. He chose 3 days of pestilence. Do you know how many people were killed in that 3 days? 70,000 people were killed in that 3 days. But it says in verse 16, at the end of verse 16, the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. Well, let me read the whole verse. When the angel stretched out his hand towards Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from the calamity. David knew he would. That's why he said, let's rely on the mercy of the Lord. I mean, he didn't know he would, but he knew that was a characteristic of God. And God said to the angel who destroyed the people, it is enough. Now relax your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. What city is the Jebus city? Jerusalem. So that plus the verse tells us they were in Jerusalem. So David decides to buy the threshing floor of Araunah in order to build an altar to praise God for the stopping of this. But Araunah said, no, I'm going to give it to you. I want you to have this, King David. How many of you know the story? Let me stop here for a minute. Of Ahab and, what was his name? Oh, the name escapes me. But the guy, Ahab wanted his house. that was right below his vineyard. And I can't think of his name. But Ahab wanted it. And Ahab went to it and offered to buy it. And he said no. So Jezebel killed him to get it, right overlooking the Jezreel Valley. What a difference in a good king versus a bad king. Here, Araunah says, I'll give you the land. But Ahab was such a bad king, the person then didn't want to give him the land. Anyway, what's his name? Nabal. Nabal. Thank you. Thank you. That was killing me. Nabal. But David said, verse 34, no, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, for I will not offer burnt sacrifices to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing. So he bought the threshing floor of Araunah, and he built an altar there, and he offered sacrifices to God. Okay, 2 Chronicles 3:1. It says, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Does that give you the location of the temple? Yes. Where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Now, Ornan and Araunah are the same person. It's like calling me by my first name and my middle name. Two different names, but the same person. And if you question that, just look at the fact that it's in Jerusalem, it's on Mount Moriah, it's the threshing floor that David had used to prepare the sacrifice to God. The threshing floor of Araunah. This is where God's building his temple. And it's where? On what mountain? Mount Moriah. And we know that's in what city? Jerusalem. All right, so when the media tells you that Israel has no claim to Jerusalem or to the land of Israel, just take them to some of these verses and prove it as we're doing today. So David built the first temple here. Solomon built the first temple here in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. 2 Kings 21:7, I already read to you. In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. Now, I don't know if God stamped his name on that mountain. He could have. I've actually seen the rock that the temple was built on, that the Dome of the Rock is built on now. They used to let us go in there, and we used to be able to look down onto the rock. Now you can't get into the Dome of the Rock, so you can't see it. So it's very possible, because there are many ups and downs in that rock, that maybe it has a sheen on it also. Very possible. But we know that in this temple, what happened? Who dwelt there? God dwelt with his people. God lived in this temple spiritually, from a spiritual standpoint. God dwelt in this temple with his people until the destruction of this temple, which happened when? In 586 BC. In the book of Ezekiel, I'll take you there for just a minute on a little bunny trail here, because it tells us very clearly that when the temple was destroyed, God left before it was destroyed. In Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 3, it says, the glory of the Lord of Israel, and that's what dwelt with the people, was the glory of the Lord. The glory of the Lord, of the God of Israel, went up from the cherubim on which it had been to the threshold of the temple. The cherubim are on top of the mercy seat that covered the Ark of the Covenant in the holy place. That's where the glory of God met. And it tells us here, and the timing of this is the destruction of the temple. It tells us here that it went up and it went to the threshold of the temple. If we go over to chapter 11, verse 23, it says, the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood over the mountain, which is east of the city. So that tells us that it went from the glory of the Lord went from the Holy of Holies over to the threshold of the temple, and now to the Mount of Olives. Then if we look at chapter 40, just a minute, let me tell you which one it is. 43, it says in verse 1 and 2, then he led me to the gate facing towards the east, and this is in the temple, and this is in the future. It says, and behold, the glory of God of Israel was coming from the way of the east, and his voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. So God is going to come back from that Mount of Olives, through that eastern gate, back into the temple. This is going to be different, because it's not just going to be the glory of the Lord, it's going to be Jesus Christ in his resurrected body. Just a side note there was one other time in between that time that the glory of the Lord actually was back in the temple. Does anybody know when that was? Luke chapter 2. In Luke chapter 2, I'll start with verse 27. Of course, we know that this is the Christmas story. It says, he came in the Spirit into the temple. We're talking about Simeon here. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to carry out for him the custom of the law, he took him into his arms and blessed God and said, Now, Lord, thou dost let thy bondservant depart in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all the people, a light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of the people Israel. So when Jesus came into the temple to be circumcised and to be dedicated, it said here he was the glory of the people Israel. But as we know, he came to his own, John 1:11, but his own received him not. So that's the only time since the first temple was destroyed in 586 BC until Jesus returns. The only time the glory of God has been in existence in Jerusalem is when Jesus was there. But he is coming back. I mean, I think this is great fun, seeing how the whole Bible fits together. And seeing God's plan for this city, the city of Jerusalem. And seeing what God is doing in the city and how important the city is. Now you get an idea of why some of us keep going back and back and back and back and back. Because even though it's a modern city, and even though it's, there's a lot of stuff that's just like Omaha, or you think it's just like Omaha when you're driving down the streets, it's a holy city, and there's nothing like it. Now the second temple was then built here. The second temple, the first temple was destroyed in 536 BC. The second temple was finished, 586 BC. The second temple was finished in 515 BC. However, over the years, it deteriorated. That was called Zerubbabel's temple. It was built in the same location on the Temple Mount. It was called Zerubbabel's temple, but it deteriorated. So by the time Herod came along in 18 BC, he reconstructed the Temple Mount because Herod was a master builder. And he took what was pretty much falling apart. We know from the book of Ezra that the second temple wasn't by Zerubbabel wasn't nearly as glorious as the first temple. So it was much smaller, and after 500 years it would have decayed. So King Herod came along and he built this magnificent temple. What you're looking at here is what's called the Holy Land model of the city of Jerusalem that is at the Israeli Museum. You're just kind of getting a glimpse of part of it. But it's made to scale exactly how the city of Jerusalem would have been at the time of Jesus Christ. This is the temple that was on the Temple Mount. That whole area right there is the Temple Mount. The temple's facing east. That gate you see right in front of you is the eastern gate, the one that Jesus will return to in that area. This is Herod's temple. He started it in 18 BC. He died, but it continued to be built and refurbished and all the other buildings built and the porticos made and everything perfected until 46 AD. So he was long gone before this temple, and Jesus was long gone before the temple was completely finished. This is the second temple. When was it destroyed? 70 AD by whom? The Romans. Okay, that was destroyed by the Romans. But this is the temple at the time of Jesus Christ. This is the temple, and this is the city. When it says in Luke 19:41, when Jesus approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and he wept over it. I don't know about you, but that's what I've been doing a lot lately, just as I look at our world and how dark we've gotten and how deceived we've gotten. I was telling someone today as we were talking that Jesus says 4 times in Matthew 24, when he's talking about the end days, 4 times he says, do not be deceived. Be careful that you're not deceived. Be careful because even the elect could be deceived. I mean, he was very clear that deception is going to be imminent and a real problem in the last days. And all you have to do is watch the news to see all the deception that's going on and all the wool that's being pulled over our eyes. from what is really truth. But anyway, Jesus wept over the city. And it was Jesus who went to the temple. You know, many times he preached in the temple. What else did he do in the temple? He overturned the money changers. How many times did he do that? Do your homework. He did it twice. He did it at the beginning of his ministry and at the end of his ministry. Now, in order to find that out, you have to do cross-referencing and you have to do the timing in the Gospels to figure that out. He did it twice. This is where Jesus often preached in the portico of Solomon. The portico of Solomon were these, if you can see it, these pillars here, just were an open-air place that were covered with a roof all around the temple. That's the portico of Solomon. Why would he teach in there? Because it's really hot in Jerusalem. And the sun shines almost all the time except for the couple of winter months. So you need shade. To be standing out in the open air in the summertime is not where you want to be. So they would need shade. So that's probably why he taught in the porticos of Solomon. Now over here on the left of the temple, you see that red roof. This is where the Sanhedrin met. It's up above, so they could watch everything that was happening on the Temple Mount. This was the governing body of 71 people, made up of scribes and Pharisees, and then the 71st person was the high priest. 70 people of the Sanhedrin who ran the religious aspects of the Jews. So this is the second temple that was destroyed. Jesus said in Matthew 23, 37 to 39, that Mary Ann mentioned earlier, right before he tells them the prophecies that are going to happen in the future, he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. What's the significance of that phrase? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's what it's believed that the priests will say when they see the Messiah coming. That's how they'll greet him. Jesus was torn and saddened over the city because he knew what was going to befall the city at his time, but also later. So 70 AD, the city was destroyed. And in Luke 21:27, Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Jerusalem was trampled over in 70 AD. Guess who still controls that mount? The Gentiles. So, Jerusalem is going to be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time is fulfilled. Now, before we go forward, too much forward, we need to fast forward to 135 AD. Because in 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian was living in the city at that time. There was an uprising by a Jewish man named Bar Kokhba that it resulted in a very similar destruction of the Jews and the city in 135 AD. At that time, Hadrian decided no longer is the city going to be called Jerusalem. So he renamed it Aelia Capitolina, another name now for Jerusalem, Aelia Capitolina. And he renamed the land that was called Israel, Syria Palestinia. Did you ever wonder where the name Palestine came from? It came from Hadrian in 135 AD. It didn't come from the Philistines. They were seafaring people on the west coast near Gaza. It came from Hadrian in 135. And that was 2,000 years after Abraham came into the city, came into the country, and was promised the country by God. Then as you move, I forgot to mention the third temple. The Bible tells us that there's going to be a third temple on that land in Ezekiel 40 to 46. And this is what the third temple is going to look like. It's going to be different than the one that we've seen, the two that we have seen in the past. You can read about the specifics of that, but it's easier to Google a picture of the third temple and read it than try and figure out what it would look like, unless you're an engineer. Now, this gives you an idea of all of Jerusalem. This is a topographical look at that Holy Land model that I mentioned. This gives you an idea of what Jerusalem looked like at the time of Christ. Here, of course, you see the Temple Mount. This also can kind of give you an idea. Temple Mount right here. Okay, now south of the Temple Mount, this whole area down here, I'm just right along here. What's that called, or what has it always been called? The City of David. It's like a little finger at the bottom, or maybe, I don't know, a finger at the bottom of the Temple Mount. That's always been referred to, still is now, the City of David. When you're there, you can clearly see the sheen. It's more clear in this picture, where it goes down the right, it goes up here, and then it goes down there. The sheen of how God stamped his name on the city. Now, this is, I say this actually wasn't at the time of Christ. This was after the time of Christ, because they actually have Golgotha being right about here. And Golgotha would have been outside the city. So the time of Christ, the city walls were right about there, and Golgotha would have been just about where the marker is, right about there. And then they increased the size of the city over the next several decades. And that's basically the size that Jerusalem stayed until Israel became a nation in 1948. Isn't that interesting? Almost 2,000 years it stayed that same size. In the 6th century, there was a mosaic that we tried to see when we were in Jordan, but there was unfortunately a Greek Orthodox service going on, so we couldn't see the whole mosaic in its original form. But this is the part of the mosaic that depicts Jerusalem. The mosaic depicts much of the Middle East at that time, and Jerusalem takes up a great portion of that mosaic, showing the importance of it. Now, you can't see it, but just to give you an idea of how prominent this is, right here where those columns are, that's the Temple Mount that we call the Temple Mount. Let's see, if you go up and to the left, you're over at Mount of Olives. Right here is the Mount of Olives. And then if you see that gate on the far left, in the middle on the far left, that's the Damascus gate. The gate down here at the south, this is the, get my bearings straight. Anyway, this is the Jaffa gate, that we go through that a lot. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre right here, which is Golgotha, the place that's believed that Jesus died, or one of the places. Anyway, the point of showing you that map is all of those places can be identified. This is 6th century mosaic, and all of those places can be identified today on that map.
Thank you for joining us today on Living Word Ministries with Debbie Blank. Living Word Ministries is a listener-supported program. To contact Debbie Blank, you may do so at livingwordministry.org. Please tune in each week at the same time for Living Word Ministries with Debbie Blank.